Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are thrilled to be here tonight with Robert Jones Jr. and Brit Bennett. We have been so excited about the Prophets since we first heard that this book was coming down the line. Y'all may better know Robert Jones as the son of Baldwin. He's done prolific writing on the internet for many a moon, and that is how we first came to know Robert Jones Jr. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers tonight, but first I want to let you know about our event co-sponsor. So tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American Culture and History. We are thrilled, as always, to be partnering with them. You will notice that we have one of our research librarian friends in the chat already, ready to kick it off. And the thing I want you to know is that they're going to be dropping links like gangbusters, and you are going to want to click on those links, but we don't want your attention to be torn away from the important discussion. So please trust that you can come back at any time and all these links will be saved. So at the end of the conversation, just come back and explore these links. Know that they will be here to enrich your experience at the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for all of the amazing work that you do at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Folks who are in Atlanta, please hit them up on their website, make an appointment with a research librarian, dig deep while they have the time to work with you during this pandemic. It is an amazing resource, and we feel very honored to be working with them as much as we get to. So I'm going to introduce Brit Bennett first. Brit really needs no introduction because her work has been just all up and down every list and on all of our shelves at Charis for the last several years. But in case you are new to Brit Bennett, she was born and raised in Southern California, graduated from Stanford University, and later earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award in graduate short fiction. In 2014, she received the Hurston Wright Award for College Writers. She is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, and her debut novel, The Mothers, was a New York Times bestseller. It was also a Charis bestseller for many years. Her second novel, The Vanishing Half, was an instant and is currently a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her essays have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Paris Review, and Jezebel. So welcome, Brit Bennett. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we're here tonight to honor the work of Robert Jones Jr. Robert was born and raised in New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing with honors and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, OK Africa, The Feminist Wire, and The Griot. He is the creator of the social justice social media community, Son of Baldwin. Jones was recently featured in T Magazine's cover story, Black Male Writers of Our Time, and The Prophets is his debut novel. So I just want to let folks know you can ask questions at any time, and you can also represent, as folks are already doing in the chat, say where you're watching from, say what you're enjoying, verbally clap for everybody, and say whatever is on your minds. We wish that we were physically gathered together, but this is our virtual house, and we want to raise the roof for Robert Jones and Brit Bennett. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hi, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this, Brit. I am a huge fan of yours, and I am kind of fanboying out right now. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this.
No, thanks for having me. I loved reading the book.
Should I start with a reading?
Please do, yes.
Okay. I am going to be reading from early in the book where Samuel and Isaiah, the two main characters of the book, are kind of having a disagreement about what to do once they discover the forces that are working against them. And so I'm going to read just a brief excerpt of that. In Isaiah's eyes was a mist, nighttime, and two sets of calloused feet creeping alongside a riverbank. Owls hooted and the snap of fallen branches being cracked in half by heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. Far behind, a point of light and the voices of wild men laughing. A glint of metal seen by the shine of the moon, and two sets of feet speed up into the wet of the river. Muddy and tired. Then, two whole bodies submerge, and though frantic, refuse to make a splash for fear of attracting the attention of jackals disguised as men. But the silence provides no shelter, and the wildness catches up to them and drags them by their feet out of the river, over jagged rocks, through the broken woods until they come upon a row of bitter, eager trees willing to perform acts of vengeance in the name of stolen fruit. The men have ropes, laughter, and fingers hooked into triggers. The men bind their prey. Nooses burn necks. Tightened, they block air. Then the eyes constrict and throats mourn, denial of screaming. Pull, pull, and up in the air the bodies go, kicking the nothing around them, flying nowhere. After a while, tuckered out down to the soul, they go limp, an offense to the gods of wicked laughter, so they unload their weapons into the dead already. Then they douse the bodies with oil and set them aflame. They think it's a campfire, so they sing songs. Look at the monkeys, swinging, swinging from the trees. The flames eventually die and the bodies eventually drop. The wild men fight over the best pieces to take home. When Isaiah snapped back to the barn, it dawned on him that he had been standing there the entire time, and neither he nor Samuel had even attempted to touch the other. He moved a step closer and stroked Samuel's cheek with the back of his hand, his rough knuckles finding comfort against Samuel's smooth skin. Samuel closed his eyes, leaned into the rhythm of Isaiah's motion before finally grabbing Isaiah's hand and holding it in place against his face. Samuel kissed Isaiah's hand. There's danger in the wilderness, Isaiah unloaded. He figured that it was only fair that the both of them share the weight of it. Samuel lifted it, inspected it, and noticed a crack in it. Those monkey swinging bodies, they dared go down without a fight? There's danger here, Samuel replied. He cut his eyes, almost with cruelty, at Isaiah and picked up the pitchfork again. Isaiah grabbed him by the waist. He stared into Samuel's face, searching for an opening, however small. Don't break us, man.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in. I have a lot of questions, and just as a reminder to everyone watching, please leave your questions in the question box below, and I will relay them to Robert when we get towards the middle or kind of end of our conversation. So as questions arise, please drop them below. So my first question, the most basic question, is where did this story begin for you? What was it that sparked this story for you?
I, as an undergraduate student, was an Africana Studies minor. I majored in creative writing, and I got to read so many great works by so many great Black authors, whether slave narratives or more contemporary works or sociological works, what have you. And being a Black queer person reading those works, you wonder where the Black queer characters are. And I noticed that they pop up right about the Harlem Renaissance, but there's little to no information about them before that. So I wondered, where are they? And I began to search for them. And so I found small references. One in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. There's a line, just one sentence, where she describes a white slave master raping a male slave. Then in the great Toni Morrison's Beloved, there's a scene in which her character, Paul D, is sexually assaulted by a male overseer. And I thought, okay, but what about love? And because Toni Morrison herself said, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, then you must write it. I was terrified to do it, but I knew that this was something that I would have to write. And how I got sort of confirmation that I should write this was in my first year of grad school. Stacy Derasmo, who was our fiction she was our fiction tutorial instructor. She gave us an assignment where we had to go out into the world and find objects that a character in a novel or story we're thinking about writing would possess. Mm-hmm. And I found a pair of shackles in the garbage in Brooklyn on the street. Wow. And I said, okay, whatever the story of these actual shackles are, here's the story I'm going to tell myself. Whoever owned these was enslaved. This is that enslaved spirit trying to talk to me, an ancestor to tell me to write down this story. And the first character that came to me from that was Samuel. And I started to kind of sketch out his life and who he was and what he liked and what he smelled like and what he looked like, who he loved. And from that kernel came the rest of the book, which took me the better part of 14 years to write.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. I don't think I've ever had a moment like that in writing of like stumbling upon something that ends up sparking an idea that you pursued for so long. So the book is kaleidoscopic in its voices and points of view, but it really does orbit around Samuel and Isaiah, who are these enslaved young men who grow up together and they fall in love, and their relationship causes, or rather the ways that in which all of these characters are reacting to their relationship causes the central tension in the book. So you said that that the first character who kind of arrived to you was Samuel. How did Isaiah arrive to you? Where did the two of them and their relationship kind of come from?
I love that you say the two of them, because that's what Maggie in the book calls them. Samuel came to me and I realized I was going to initially write the book solely from Samuel's point of view. But then I realized I'm falling into the trap that many people fall into when they write about or even focus on Blackness and queerness, is that they make the Black queer person neutered in some way. They're not in love, they're not having sex, they're not having a life, they're just some appendage or something to be studied, like some sort of pathological clinical thing. So I said, Samuel needs to be in love, and he needs to be deeply in love, and I need to figure out who this character that he's in love with is. So Isaiah was born from those questions of who he loves. And from that, I was like, well, then the book might need to be from both of their points of view, but that still didn't give me what I felt the book needed to get a full picture of this life. So I said, they need witnesses. And so from that, Maggie was the first to emerge. And then the other characters started to come. And then I also wrestled with myself over whether or not I wanted to give the white plantation owners a point of view in this book. But I thought that was vitally important because I needed to answer a question for myself. What could make people behave this way? What could make someone look at another human being and say, I don't see a human being? Yeah. So I wanted to sort of answer those questions for myself. So I included some white characters in this book as well. And that is essentially how the name The Prophets came to be. When I heard a voice tell me, you do not yet know us, and I knew that the ancestors too would also have to have a voice in this, I realized that the witnessing was tied very closely to the Christian idea of witnessing. And that's why the book sort of has these biblical overtones, and the characters have biblical names, and the chapters are also biblically attuned. And I knew that witnesses were essentially prophets, and that maybe that these characters were operating in that way because they were telling us vital things about ourselves that we rather not know. And that is the burden of the prophet, is that no one believes you until it's too late.
Well, so one of the things that you spoke to, I was curious about, which was your choice to write from the point of view of these white characters. So one of the questions I have is what research did you do? Did you do research to get in that? Like, how did you get into that headspace? Was that challenging for you to get into that headspace? And did writing from that point of view answer that question that you started with of what could cause these characters to behave this way?
Yes, I did get answers. And I did do a lot of research. So I was reading Thomas Jefferson's Notes from a State of Virginia. Like I was just like reading it backward and forward. He was crucial in getting me to understand how a white person could arrive at these ideas and think that they were just and righteous. And I read even some of George Washington's behavior helped to inform this. He had an enslaved woman named Ona Judge who escaped, and he followed her for 15 years trying to find her. And Martha Washington resented that, which told me a lot about what was going on. It wasn't explicitly stated, but I can almost guarantee that Ona Judge was the victim of his advances. All of these thoughts and stuff, I was just thinking, okay, so this is what they are. Why are they this way? So I just started going back into the research, going back to European settlers and so-called like people like Christopher Columbus and all of these people. And I realized that it comes from what Dr. Joy DeGruy calls an axiology, where Europeans lived in very harsh, in a very harsh environment. So they had a very adversarial approach to nature. They wanted to conquer nature, whereas people in on the continent of Africa were living in abundance. And so the most important relationship for them was people to people, whereas the most important relationship for many Europeans was land and ownership and having resources. And so some of that springs out of that particular relationship. But also what I realized is that a lot of this is just passed down behaviors, that children are born essentially innocent and are taught to behave this way by the parents who think that this behavior is justifiable and right. And then the essential thing that I learned was power corrupts absolutely. Whomever holds power over another person or dominion over another person is going to abuse it. Period. The end. No matter what race, no matter what gender, no matter what sexuality, no matter what gender identity, ability, whatever. If you have power over someone else, you're going to abuse it. And so it made me learn that there's a difference between power, which is dominion over someone else, and empowerment, which is dominion over myself.
Well, I guess along those lines, I'm curious if you read slave narratives and if you found those instructive, because I think also, this book joins a tradition that I think, obviously a storied tradition of stories that are about slavery, but also kind of within this particular moment, you have, books like The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. You have more contemporary writers or filmmakers or kind of diving into this topic. So I'm curious if you read slave narratives or if you were watching some of these films that are coming out now. How did you find your book, either in conversation with them or even in opposition to them?
I was indeed reading every slave narrative that I could get my hands on. Equiano was the earliest one that I read, where he talked about, it was very interesting because what we learn about slavery is that it was good for the Black person to be enslaved because we were civilized, because we were savages and this was a civilizing enterprise. And two, we were Christianized. So we were introduced to Jesus Christ, which can then save our souls. Equiano's point of view was we were already civilized. In fact, I had to teach you how to bathe, how to wash your hands before you eat, how to clean your food, how to clean your surgical instruments before you perform surgeries. You did not know any of this, so how dare you call me a savage? So it was very vital reading these slave narratives and understanding what our ancestors were outside of this white gaze. And I think I do see myself in conversation with the other writers and filmmakers who are broaching this subject. I know that I've heard countless times from many people within Black communities, let's stop talking about slavery because it's been there, done that, let's stop. But my perspective is that if there were 20 million enslaved people, there are 20 million stories to tell, and not every story is told. Like, for example, I outside of Danye Love's Sugar in Our Wounds, which it was an off-Broadway play, I've never read or seen anything about two Black queer people during this time period. So I felt like I had to write about it. But I do feel like these stories, whether Underground Railroad or others, it's like Marlon James's Book of Night Women. So where he's talking about slavery in Jamaica. And I never knew very much about slavery in Jamaica, so I'm still learning stuff. Or even Gail Jones's Corregidora, which talks about slavery in Brazil. So it is a history that we think we know so much about until we start uncovering all of these other things, and then it becomes like new again. So yes, I am in conversation with these other writers, and I hope more writers continue to uncover this time period.
Yeah, I think also, I think some of the reason, I think one of the reasons for some of that resistance that you're describing is also because I think for a lot of people, a lot of Black people, it is painful. You know, it is painful to engage with, to think about. I think there's still a feeling of shame that people feel. And I think that is part of the reason, because you're totally right that we have not had enough narratives about slavery. It's not that there are too many, but I think that there's that feeling. And I'm wondering what the experience of writing this book was for you emotionally. There are some moments of love and tenderness and community in this book, but there are also some moments of brutality and violence. I mean, I think that probably goes without saying. So what was that experience like for you writing those sections?
I knew that when I started writing this book that I would have to absolutely portray slavery as the brutality and violence that it is. That there is no happy darkies on a cotton plantation singing songs. This is genocide and Holocaust on a plantation, like we're a living one. So they're not putting us into gas chambers, but they're whipping us into an inch of our lives and raping us until we can no longer think. So I knew that I would have to portray that. And I said, okay, if I have to portray this, I'm going to have to portray it in a way that I could at least infuse love and community and tenderness and softness, so that the slavery is the backdrop and that the enslaved people are the foreground, and they are full and complex and dimensional. And it was hard, Britt. It was so hard. Some scenes that I wrote, I had to like let the subconscious take over, because if I was consciously paying attention to what I was writing, I could feel the pain of it. And so I said, if I could feel the pain of it, the reader's going to be able to feel the pain of it. So I have to give them something else too. So you have, for example, the chapter Babel, where Samuel and Isaiah face some brutality. Immediately following that then is Balm in Gilead, where the women come together to do a healing ceremony. And so that is the way I try to help myself and the reader get through something that we desperately need to confront in this country, because if we don't, we're doomed to things like what we're witnessing right now in 2021.
Right. I think another thing that this book does, perhaps, I mean, definitely one of the better examples of this, of books that I've read about slavery, is that it really focuses not only on this sexual violence that these characters are experiencing, but also the way in which that's tied into capitalism. And, you know, I think when I started reading this book, or when I saw the premise of this book about this gay couple at the center of it, I assumed, okay, well, this is going to be a source of conflict because of homophobia, Christianity, those very obvious sort of sources of tension. But the book also makes such a clear case of that it's also because of this connection to capitalism and the necessity of this enslaver to force the enslaved people to reproduce because that is producing capital for him. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that and that choice to center, to show it's almost as if the kind of Christian argument comes after the capitalist argument, you know, less than any type of sort of religious indictment of their behavior. It's more the fact that they are not reproducing more enslaved people for this plantation owner. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. When I was doing my research and reading about this time period, my mind was continually blown by the horrors, things that they never taught me in school about this time period, and that was intentional because they knew that if they revealed to young people this is what this country is built on, you could not love this country. It would be difficult, if not impossible. One of the things I learned about was the breeding farms, where they literally set up farms just for slaves to be forced to reproduce. And it was just horrid. And I said, I want to talk about that horror in the context that I learned it in, which is you're doing this because you can no longer import slaves. So now you have to force the enslaved people to have sex so that they can produce slaves for you. And if they don't have sex, you will even rape them to produce children that would then be enslaved. They'd be your children, but you wouldn't care. They'd be your property too. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to include that in there. And the interesting thing I found about the capitalism argument and the Christianity argument was how well they blended. Mm-hmm. In that I began to see the Bible as a nation building document rather than a spiritual one. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not be homosexual. All of these things were to ensure that the nation or the king had enough laborers, had enough soldiers, that his kingdom would be enlarged, and therefore he can protect his stuff from the neighboring kingdom coming over and taking their stuff. Because I have more people, I have a bigger army, we have more workers, we have more land, all of this other kind of stuff. When I started to think about the Bible in those capitalistic terms, many questions I had about the Bible began to make sense to me. And it made so much sense to me how these plantation owners used it to justify their behavior toward Black people on these plantations. I was like, now I get it. Now this makes sense. Now I know why these white characters feel the way they do.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone, I see there are already some questions that have come in. Please, as questions arise, drop them into the question box. We'll get to them shortly. So kind of, I guess along the line of monarchy, there are some really interesting sections in this book that are set within a kingdom in Africa, and centering around a female king. So I'm curious of what research you did in writing that part of the book, and why did you find those sections set in Africa and that whole kind of storyline, the way that plays out? Why was that important for you to include in this book?
Great questions. I did do a ton of research because there's this idea in many Black communities held by the people that are derisively called hoteps. I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
I am, yes.
The hoteps are Black people who are very pro-Black, but in a very particular way. It has to be patriarchal, and it has to be male, and it has to be cisgender and heterosexual. Mm-hmm. They believe these ideas that homosexuality or queerness or transgenderness come from the fact that we were enslaved, and these pathologies were forced upon us via trauma and violence. Mm-hmm. And that prior to this, in pre-colonial Africa, everybody was cisgender and heterosexual. So my research uncovers that is patently false. Mm-hmm. And I find that in not just the anthropological and sociological works, but also in the oral histories. For example, Esther Ama, who is a brilliant artist and activist, is from Ghana. And she says, if you asked my grandparents, what is a homosexual? They'd be like, I don't know what you mean. Mm-hmm. And Americans take that to mean that there were no homosexuals in Ghana. But no, they just misunderstood your question, because we don't have terms like that, because we didn't see that as something to separate or think of as odd or despicable. Mm-hmm. We approach gender and sexuality like we approach the land. There are no boundaries. And that is what I discovered. And even more so, I discovered that because there were no boundaries, words like king did not tie to gender. It tied to position. So whomever held the position was king. And in many cases, it was what we now know as women. Maybe they regarded themselves as something other, but they were women. And so, yeah. And
there's that.
And that was. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying there's that great moment when, well, not great, and for the sake of the book, but that great scene where the colonizer has arrived, and she introduces herself as a king, and he corrects it to queen, because that's his understanding of gender and position, and that's him like imposing that framework on this ruler.
It was mind-blowing to me to discover these things, because here I am, trained and educated in the West, thinking that our ideas of gender and sex and all of these things are universal, and they are so not. They are so not.
And I think this book does it so well, of not only defamiliarizing ourselves from this idea that these concepts are universal, but also reminding us, as you said, that they are also, it's also ahistorical to think that everyone in every culture and throughout all time periods has considered gender or has considered sexuality in the way that people do now.
Right.
So this book does a great job of reminding us of that. So one of the tensions I thought, so we're talking about this. I'm trying to keep the conversation a little bit broad, because I know the book just came out and we don't want to ruin all of the plot points. People haven't yet read it. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Samuel and Isaiah's relationship. I think that their relationship is really at the center of the book, and how characters are reacting to their relationship. And not only that, but we see that they have differing their nuances and their levels of comfort with the relationship, their nuances in the ways in which they relate to gender. So I'm wondering if you could talk about their dynamic in the center of the book, what drew you to writing their dynamic, and maybe even, what brought you joy in writing that relationship. I imagine that's the type of relationship that would bring you joy in writing it, at least in part. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about creating that relationship.
Sure. It did bring me a great deal of joy to write about Samuel and Isaiah, particularly the fact that everything in Isaiah's mind, in Samuel's mind tells him, I don't want to do this, but everything in his heart makes him. And I love that Isaiah understands his reservations and provides him the room and the safety to have those reservations, but also holds him to account for it. So I love that their relationship is romantic, but it's also fraught. I love that it's intimate, but it's also tense. So I love that it's not simple, because often you'll read about it's one or the other. There's always these binaries where we write about these kinds of relationships and they're all happy-go-lucky and everything's wonderful and peachy clean, or they're all pathology and that's it. I wanted it to feel real, like two real people in a real relationship. And as I said earlier, Samuel came to me first, and he presented himself to me as very masculine and strong and aggressive. And Isaiah, when he came to me, he presented as rather strategic and a little bit more feminine and a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more free. And I thought, oh, this will make a great yin and yang. They're going to fit together so well. but they're also going to have tension, but that tension is never going to let that bond break. And what's going to happen is that once they realize that they're being watched, what effect is that going to have on Samuel, and what effect is that going to have on Isaiah? And so it was just really interesting to watch that unfold.
Yes. I also just love that this, I love that this relationship, and even throughout the book, there are moments, as we said, there are moments of tenderness, there are moments of humor, there are moments of people being flirtatious. I mean, I don't know how many times these are things that I've seen in books about slavery, because I think that there can be a focus on, rightly on the brutality and violence. But I also think there's something almost dehumanizing of only rendering lives of enslaved people in that light, because it's, like our full kind of human experiences are these moments of tenderness or these moments of lightness, even amongst great violence and great brutality. So I love that this book captured that within that relationship, but also in the relationships of some of the other characters surrounding the two.
Yeah, I was very invested in making sure that the defining characteristics of these characters, the Black ones, wasn't that they were enslaved. They were people, and readers who read this book will notice that they only refer to themselves as people. They do not refer to themselves as slaves unless they're being derisive toward one another. Otherwise, they are people, and that is how I see them. I'm the descendant of enslaved people. They were people, and only in the white gaze do we see the slavery as taking precedence over their humanity. I saw it the other way around. Their humanity took precedence. It was, in fact, the enslavers who, as Toni Morrison would put it, gave up their humanity that through that brutality.
Absolutely. So I want to get to the questions from the audience, but the last two I have for you. So one is, many of us became familiar with you as a writer through Son of Baldwin, through your writing online. So I'd love to know, how was writing this novel different than writing online? What was this experience of how's the experience of publishing this novel different than publishing something online? I'm just curious to know what that journey has been for you.
Writing the novel was a rather solitary experience, where I had to do a lot of meditative work to open myself up to whatever creative voices the ether decide to filter through me, to hear the voices of my ancestors, to feel what they needed to say to me. But otherwise, I was in this office, or on my front stoop, or on the train, sitting in the last car, just scribbling down all of these notes and these sentences and these words in a way that was profoundly lonely. In a sense. Son of Baldwin is a space where it is by its nature communal. So whatever I post or say, everyone comments from everywhere. Even people who do not mean what I consider my community good. They don't mean good. They don't have good intentions. So it's opened up to toxicity and negativity and verbal violence and so on and so forth, where the Prophets was a sort of safer space for me to explore these ideas, and but then having to bring other people in at points so that I could see, is this worth it? Am I writing up to the highest level that I could write? Does this make any sense to you? Am I making a fool of myself? Somebody give me some criticism so that I can understand whether I should abandon this project or keep going. The other thing is where the Prophets work and the Son of Baldwin work sort of merged, was having these wonderful conversations online with people who I would have otherwise not had conversations with. Black lesbians in Zimbabwe, Black transgender women in Nigeria, like intersex Black people in Brazil, having these conversations, understanding their interpretations of race and identity was crucial in me understanding, I have to broaden my perspective. The West is not everything here. This is a global book, and it needs to reflect that in the best way I know how to make it so. So that's kind of where the two kind of met up.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Okay, and then the last question I just have to ask: what your book was shouted out by Mariah Carey during her Instagram post last year. I gotta ask what that experience was like for you seeing that, because I mean, first of all, it's exciting to be on a list compiled by Mariah Carey, but also I can't imagine the experience of that as your debut, and also before your debut has even hit the shelves, like to get some pre-pub love from Mariah Carey. So please, the people want to know, and the people being me, what was that experience like for you to see that she loved your book?
It was absolutely unbelievable because apparently no one knew that this was going to happen. My publicist didn't know, my editor didn't know, my agent didn't know. Somebody tagged me on Twitter and was like, "Son of Baldwin, did you see this?" And I said, "Oh, look at Mariah. She's probably doing her All I Want for Christmas stuff again." And then I looked at the book and I said, "Oh, she's got her book there." And then I was like, "Oh my God, the Prophets." So I immediately texted my agent, my publicist, and my editor, and then everybody just went absolutely bananas.
Crazy,
like,
sure.
oh my goodness. And then someone tweeted, one of these books on this list is actually still an advanced reader copy. Kudos to that publicist. And I was just like, wow, that was just, Mariah Carey is one of my favorite entertainers of all time. Behind, I would say, only Janet Jackson. Just the fact that she has my book up there and that she read it and that she recommended it, that is like, I could lay down now and go to glory. I could go right to glory now. Knock on wood. But that was like the moment of 2020 for me.
That's great. Well, that's great. She has great taste, and we know that 2021 is going to be even better for you in this book. So, okay, let's jump into some of the questions. I want to make sure to get to some of these. I'll get to, and please continue to ask your questions as they're coming in. So the top question, this is interesting. So this question says, this is from Brian. So he says, both The Vanishing Half and The Prophets feature LGBTQ characters, and specifically Black queer characters. Could these books have been written 10 or 20 years ago and been as well received?
Ooh, no. Well, Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple and won a Pulitzer for it. And that her book, not so much the movie kind of diminished and minimized the relationship between Celie and Shug Avery. But the book was quite bold about the lesbian relationship between the two major characters. So my instinct was to say no, but I returned to Alice Walker, who wrote that brilliant book and did it way back then. So
this is just my question. I'm curious, are there any other Black queer authors that were important to you reading, or that or books like The Color Purple that were really important to you as you were growing up or becoming a writer?
Absolutely. I was introduced to James Baldwin a little late, my freshman year. But once I learned about him and his work, that blew my mind completely open. I discovered a writer. He died very young at age 32 of tuberculosis and only wrote 2 books. Wallace Thurman, who was writing during the Harlem Renaissance period. He wrote a book called The Blacker the Berry and another book called Infants of the Spring. And he was writing in 1929 about queerness, Blackness and queerness in the Harlem Renaissance. And that's like the earliest that I could find of that topic being broached. So maybe the answer to that question is probably maybe, because we have some examples of people writing those things and it being well received. So perhaps.
That's great. Okay, so Kelly says, Robert said it took him 14 years to write this book. What was that process like? What were the biggest challenges?
The biggest challenge, finding the time. Because when you're going to school and you know, all of your professors are acting like that's the only class you're taking. And so you have a ton of papers to write, and you're trying to do, you had to get your little manuscript or story ready for workshop 2, and then you have to go work 2 part-time jobs because you're also having to pay your own tuition because the scholarships don't cover everything, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. You just have to commit, okay, after I'm done writing these 6 papers, I'm going to sleep for 2 hours, get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, write for an hour for this book, go back to sleep before I have to head to work and then school. Like, you just have to commit. And it's not going to always be the amount of time you want to give it. And that's why it took me 14 years, because I had to find the witching hour, the midnight hour, the moments on the train where I had 20 minutes to jot some stuff down. Hopefully the second novel won't take me 14 years, but who knows? But this one, I just wanted to get right. I wanted every sentence to be on a level that Toni Morrison would look at that and say, okay, I approve. And I just wanted to commit to these characters because a lot of this, I was writing for the ancestors who are no longer here and who were erased from the cultural and the historical narrative. And yeah, 14 years of just trying and being insecure that I was not doing a good enough job. And so sometimes having to put it down and walk away from it until I had the courage to come back.
Okay, so this is a question from Kelly. She says, Mr. Jones thanks Janet Jackson in a very moving paragraph at the end of the novel. What influence did Miss Jackson, if you're nasty, have on the prophets? I love that question, Kelly.
You know what? If there are any moments of dance in the prophets, I was probably thinking of Janet Jackson's Got Till It's Gone video. I don't know if you've ever seen that video, but she's in South Africa during the apartheid time, and she's in a club and dancing, whatever. Yes, those images of blackness, of that rich, beautiful, dark blackness, of Black people being in camaraderie and just feeling the rhythm from a instinctual gut level place, that probably inhabits and haunts the book. Whenever you see dancing, I'm thinking about that. Also, Janet Jackson, I have to credit her for being the first person to open my mind up to thinking about sociopolitics in a way that I didn't know that I had permission to think about it, in terms of knowing myself as a Black person, as a queer person, and living at those intersections with the Rhythm Nation album. So Rhythm Nation, I'm about 18 years old. So I'm just starting to understand politics in a way that I'm like, oh, now I'm a grown up, so I can start thinking about these things. Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation really helped shape me in that way.
I love that. Here's a question. This is from Becca, and this is a character we didn't talk about much, but I'm wondering if you can introduce him a little bit to the people who have not yet read the book. So this is from Becca, and she says, Amos is a complicated person and character in the novel. Can you talk about your experience of writing his point of view and turning the community against Isaiah and Samuel? So if you could tell us who Amos is and the experience of writing from that point of view.
Amos is an elder character, enslaved man on the plantation who is trying his best to save the life of someone. And in order to do so, he makes a kind of a Sophie's choice of sacrificing one to save the other. And in writing him, I had to get to a place where I wasn't angry at him. So I had to give him a reason for his actions that weren't steeped in evil, that had some complexity to it, and might be something that I might do if put in the same position. He wasn't difficult to write because I knew so many elder people in my life who come from from Amos's perspective, who become wrapped in the glory that is Christianity. Because let's face it, Christianity is very seductive. When I used to go to church as a kid, I loved church because of the singing, the dancing, the way the preacher preached with his rhythms and his have mercies. and all of that stuff, the people falling out and catching the Holy Spirit and all of that stuff was just so beautiful and lovely, and just represented to me liberation and abandon. But then when I realized myself as a queer person, I realized that that was no longer a safe space for me. And so knowing people like Amos in my real life made it easy to kind of visualize him in the novel.
I love that. I think Amos was, I feel weird saying one of my favorite characters, but I think his complexity, I think it speaks to that. If the character does things that you don't like, but you still are invested and interested in them, I think that speaks to the complexity of that character. So these kind of questions are sort of connected. This is, so one question is sort of, do you have advice for aspiring writers? And this other question is, how do you improve your storytelling skills? And do you recommend an MFA? So these felt kind of married questions. If you want to speak to them however you find interesting.
I'm going to take the MFA question first. I just had a conversation the other night with Maisie Card, who wrote These Ghosts Are Family. She and I were in the same MFA program. And I didn't realize that her experience in that program was almost identical to my own. We were at Brooklyn College MFA. Michael Cunningham was our program director at the time. He wrote The Hours, won the Pulitzer for that. And there were only 4 Black students in that cohort. And we realized that we never had any workshops together, Maisie and I. They kind of split us up. And so Maisie was in a workshop she was the only Black person in the workshop. I was in a workshop where I was the only Black person in the workshop. And our works were constantly subject to white gazes. And that made it, Maisie said that someone said something so racist to her that she took a semester off. Oh, wow. Someone said to me that I was in danger of becoming a Black writer and that I should stop writing about race, and that he had a right to say that to me because his mother was raped by a Black man. And no one checked him on that.
Oh my gosh.
No one checked him. And I didn't have the language then to say, you are also writing about race.
Yeah.
And I have the right to say that to you because your people oppressed mine for centuries. But I didn't have that language. My point being, yes, I do recommend an MFA because you get to see the world on a microcosm level immediately. So you know what you're going to face as a marginalized writer writing, whatever your marginalization category is. You confront it right up front and you know what you're in for. I also recommend an MFA program because it teaches you not to fall in love with your first draft. Because many of us as writers, we think the first thing we write is absolutely brilliant until we realize, no, the point of writing is revision. And you're going to revise this a zillion times before you get to the level that it should be at and that you are ultimately satisfied with. So yes, I do recommend that. And my advice to aspiring writers is please write. The world, particularly if you're in this country, in the United States despises its artists because artists are the truth tellers. We bear the burden of having to hold the mirror up to the country and say, no, 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 you are not the greatest country in the world. This is not America the Beautiful. No, God does not bless America. This is a problem. You are in a deep state of denial, and we are going to continue to show you who you are until you face who you are. So writers, Toni Morrison said, especially in times like this is when writers get to work. Artists get to work right now. So I say to aspiring writers, write, because it's always a daunting task to look at the blank page and there's nothing on there and you don't know where to start. Just start wherever, beginning, middle, end, wherever. Start. And then there was the other question, which was there was one more question and I forget it.
Oh, let's see. No, I think you spoke to them. You kind of spoke to this a bit, but it was about improving, how you improve as a writer.
Oh, how you improve. Read. The way that you become a better writer is that you read as much as you can. Before I started writing The Prophets, and sometimes in the middle of The Prophets, when I was stuck, I would stop. Like, for example, when I could not figure out the structure of this book, I returned to Toni Morrison's Paradise. I went to Ayanna Mathis's The 12 Tribes of Hattie to figure out how am I going to make it so that all of these characters have their point of view and it not feel like I'm telling 13 different stories. So reading is vital in developing yourself as a writer.
I agree. So this is a question from Leandra, who asks, you spoke to us a little bit about the chapters having biblical references, but her question is the order with which you title each chapter, how you selected that, which was there deeper meaning, she says. Well, the full question, she says, is why did you use books from the Bible as titles to some of the chapters? Was there a deeper meaning behind the names of those books and order with which you titled each chapter?
In some cases, the titles reveal the tone and the direction of the story being told in that chapter. If you know the Bible, like, for example, one is really obvious. There's a title called Exodus, and that is what you imagine Exodus means, a leaving of something. But then there are other chapters where the point of the chapter is to confront or conflict with the Bible chapter that it's named after. And so you'll have certain chapters where that happens. And most of the characters also have biblical names, and some of them correspond to their biblical characters. Paul, who is the plantation owner, is the cruelest of them all, because Paul in the Bible is also the most misogynist, the most cruel of all of Jesus's disciples. You have Maggie, who is Mary Magdalene. That's her counterpart, and she in some ways embodies the rebelliousness and also the loyalty of that character. So yeah, in some cases the Bible informs the character or chapter, and sometimes it's in conversation or an argument. And the way that the chapters are lined up, the order came together organically based on where the characters led me.
I love that. So we have time for a couple more questions. So this one is from Sally. She says, just need to recognize the amazing work of the librarian in these links tonight, which I'm saying thank you for posting all of those links. Robert, I've heard you say your librarians are superheroes to you. Can you say more about that?
Librarians are absolutely superheroes to me. I love librarians. My first memorable encounter with a librarian was, I grew up in a section of Brooklyn on the border of Bensonhurst and Gravesend, which at the time was super anti-Black. And so every day after school, we would get chased home by these white kids in the neighborhood. They would chase us home every single day with bats and bottles and chains, chase us back to the projects, because I lived in a projects that was surrounded by Irish and Italian immigrants. And one time when I was running, it looked like the racists were going to catch up to me and do me great harm. A librarian, as I'm running past the library, swings open the door, grabs me, pulls me in, closes the door, and locks it.
Oh, wow.
And sits with me for like 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, reading to me, letting me read books, letting me take some home eventually, and walked me home to ensure that I would be safe. So librarians are indeed superheroes to me. And here's the other part. I'm a big comic book reader. I've been collecting comic books since I was 4 years old. One of my favorite characters is Batgirl. And Batgirl is a librarian. She is the head librarian of the Gotham City library system. So
I love that. I love that so much. I guess we have 1 more minute. So do you have anything that you're reading right now or that you're watching, anything that you're loving that's helping you get through? Thank you. It's helping you get through this quarantine.
Your book is up next. I'm currently reading Disha Filyaw's The Secret Life of Church Ladies. After your book, I'm going to read Black Buck by Mateo Ascarapour. Then I'm going to read Memorial by Brian Washington. So basically everything on this level is my TBR.
Got it.
Other than The Prophets is going to be books that I have to read. And my TBR list is like maybe 37 books deep. But yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you. I think we're kind of running up against time. So thank you so much, Robert, for presenting this. And thank you for inviting me to do the conversation with you.
I was, when they told me that you agreed to come do this, I was geeking out. I'm so happy. Also, I should say this, Britt, I am so proud of you. You are
Thank you.
representing,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
doing the damn thing, walking around here with a #1 book, acting like you just regular.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is an incredible conversation. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody in the comments. Everybody was loving it. So we appreciate all of y'all participating from home. I'm so appreciative to both of you for all of the gifts that you have given us in your words. And I hope that you stay safe and well throughout this pandemic and beyond. Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you.
Charis, thank you so much for having us. We adore you. Thank you. Independent booksellers, be sure you support your independent booksellers, please.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks.